Hello and welcome to our Recording Reproduction online session. My name's Emma McCrabb and I am the Senior Development Officer with Sheep Genetics. In today's session, what we want to do is we want to help breeders get their reproduction recording right. We know that if reproduction is an important trait in your breeding objective, that recording it as directly as possible allows us to make faster genetic gain. However, we are aware that there's a huge amount of variety in the way pedigree and reproduction is recorded across industry. So what we've tried to do at Sheep Genetics is pull together a checklist that can help breeders from joining through to weaning remember what data needs to be recorded to contribute to their reproduction breeding values. So I'm not sure if everyone has heard of them, but we've got a new reproduction evaluation. We call it our component reproduction evaluation. And this has been rolled out in the merino and maternal genetic evaluations, initially as research breeding values. However, they were promoted to ASBBs this year. That is except condition score, but I'll go through those traits in more detail shortly. Looking to the future, we're looking at transitioning away from our old number of lambs weaned evaluation. So it'll be really important to make sure that breeders are recording these new reproduction traits as effectively as possible, particularly as we look to phase NLW out of indexes and possibly replace it with this new component evaluation traits. So the reason that we want to transition away from the old number of lambs weaned evaluation is that in this evaluation, we were masking some of the extent of lamb loss. So if we take an example to show this, we've got 2 ewes here. And these 2 ewes both weaned 2 lambs. However, in the NLW evaluation, what we weren't accounting for is how those ewes actually got to weaning. So this first ewe, she actually gave birth to triplets and lost a lamb. Whereas this second ewe gave birth to twins and reared her entire litter. So from a lamb loss perspective, the second ewe is probably a more desirable ewe. And in that number of lambs weaned evaluation, we were actually masking not only the true extent of lamb loss, but also where we were losing those lambs in the reproduction cycle. So the new reproduction evaluation was developed. So this is based on the component traits of number of lambs weaned. So the first trait is conception. So this is whether or not the ewe conceived. Then we've got litter size, which is how many lambs the ewe gave birth to. And then we have ewe rearing ability. So of the lambs that ewe gave birth to, how many did she actually rear through to weaning? We then have a couple of additional traits. So we've got this maternal behaviour score trait, which is scored on a 1 to 5 scale when you're at the birth site. So 1 being more desirable, the ewe doesn't move far from you when you're tagging that lamb at birth. 5, is that you don't ever see the ewe again after that tagging event. These 4 traits and their yearling counterparts, we're also reporting these traits as yearling for if you're joining new lambs, are all now ASBBs in the Merino Select and maternal evaluation. We have an additional trait, which is a pre-joining condition score. This trait is still in its research phase, so it's still a research breeding value. And that's just, we need more industry data to be able to firm up the parameters around how we use that trait. So there's a couple of reasons that we love the new evaluation. From a breeder perspective, these new traits mean that you can make more targeted genetic gain. So for example, if fertility is an issue in your flock, you can actually target conception specifically. From an SG perspective, we're really excited about the validation rules around this trait, these traits. So in this new evaluation, validation is at a group level rather than as a joining cohort. So to break that down, in the old number of lambs weaned evaluation, if you had dry ewes in that joining, it was essentially a tick box to say, yes, you get number of lambs born information. Then if you had ewes that lambed and lost in that joining, so for example, dead at birth lambs, it was another tick box to say, yes, you get number of lambs weaned information. In this new evaluation, it actually checks every group for that information. So for example, every joining group is checked for dry ewes. The same, every rearing group is checked for ewes that lambed and lost. The beauty of this is that it actually uses more data. So for example, if you have high conception in a group and we don't have enough variation in conception because too many ewes are pregnant, although we won't be using that information for conception, let's say you've also preg scanned for multiple, so we've got variation in litter size. This means that we are actually using more data because although the ewes weren't included in the conception part of the evaluation, they will be included in the litter size part of the evaluation. So the checklist. It's quite a big job to bring this together to suit the varying, very varied recording structures across industry. So we've developed this checklist. About halfway through, there's a fork in the road. And if you just bear with me, a couple of slides won't be relevant to everyone who's watching this video. And that's just because, you know, you might be tagging at birth versus, you know, mothering up later through DNA parentage or using collars or some method like that. So we're going to go through from joining through to weaning, absolutely everything that you need to record to be included in this reproduction evaluation. This first slide, these are the overall requirements for the new reproduction evaluation. So it's only relevant to maternals and merinos. And what it says is that you need to tick these two boxes to actually be included in the reproduction, the component reproduction evaluation. So for maternals and merinos, we need to have at least 70% of the drop with dam pedigree. The reason for that is that reproduction is a trait that we're recording on the ewe. And if we have at least 70% dam pedigree in the drop, we're capturing a large portion of the variation in our between ewes in our joining cohort. The second one is a bit more complex to explain, but this is a birth type consistency measure. What it does is it compares the birth types of lambs. So in the birth type column, it actually sums up the birth types of lambs and compares this to the total number of lambs, the number of animal IDs for that drop. What this measure is doing is it's validating how well we're recording birth information. So now we get into the part that's relevant for all breeds. We really want, where possible, all our joining information to be included in the mating module or the mating database of your software. So that will be where you can add in joining information. So things like ram in and ram out dates. We want the backup ram information as well. So we want his ID and his ram in and ram out date. The really important thing with any of the dates in reproduction is that we check these when they come through. However, we just want to make sure that you just provide them as accurately as possible. So, you know, if the ram is out for 6 months, just provide us with that information so that we can make sure we're using that joining information correctly. At joining, you can also take a joining weight of the ewe and a condition score. We want a management group. That management group is really important. So that's how the ewes have been managed in the lead up to the ram going out. And then we also want the conception method of the ewe. And the reason we want the conception method of the ewe is for something like embryo transfer ewes. We actually don't use these in the reproduction evaluation because they've had you know, other influences on their reproductive ability. One thing I do just want to pull out here is that In the past, we've talked about our pre-joining information being taken 30 days either side of the ram going in. In this evaluation, we need it to be taken in the 30 days in the lead up to the ram going in or on the day he goes in. And the reason for that is in our weight and condition score. So this joining weight will contribute to your adult weight ASBVs, and the condition score will contribute to your research breeding values. But what we're not doing is we're not accounting for reproduction status when we're in these two traits. So it's really important to take this information at a time that we've got the least amount of reproduction influence over this trait. Then if you're preg scanning, and identifying dry ewes this way, you don't need to use the old DRY tags. They used to be fictitious lambs that you would enter into your software to fill in the gaps for the dry ewes. If you're sending us your preg scanning information, you don't need to do this anymore. We'll pick up those dry ewes from the preg scan result being 0 or dry. If you're scanning for multiples, what this does is it actually fills in any gaps in birth type. So we use a preg scan information as a secondary source of birth type information when we don't have that ewe matched to a lamb, a live lamb or a dead lamb down the track. So if, for example, a ewe is scanned and then goes missing, and we never see a lamb matched to her, we'll use the preg scanning results as her birth type. So when we're scanning for multiples, this is informing that conception trait and also the litter size trait. We can also use wet and dry scanning to some degree. However, we obviously aren't getting litter size information with a wet dry scan. So we're actually just using that for the conception part of the evaluation. One important note is to not retrospectively change your scan results based on the live lambs that you then match that ewe to. So for example, we might have a ewe that was scanned as a single, but you end up matching her to two lambs. Leave the scan as it is, remembering that it's a secondary source of information. So we'll actually be using the live lamb or the lambs that she's been matched to rather than the preg scan. But we want you to leave it there just because it'll allow us to go back and have a look at scanner accuracy into the future. So this is that fork in the road that I was talking about. So we've got two scenarios here. One is where we're active at lambing, so we might be tagging at birth. And the other is for those that aren't at the birth site. So ideally, for those that aren't at the birth site, we're collecting this information in this column here as early as possible, so marking rather than weaning. And that's because this is our proxy for birth information. So we want it to be as close to birth as we can get it. I'm just focused on the tagging at birth situation. So this is breeders that are getting out there and tagging lambs within 24 hours of birth. So when we're doing this, what we're doing is we're identifying dams of lambs through dam pedigree. We're identifying what we're calling real birth type. So we actually know how that lamb was born, and real dead at birth lambs because we're actually eyeballing lambs on the ground. We're getting an exact date of birth because we're getting out there within 24 hours of the lambs being born. We've got our conception method of the lamb, but we've also got a few additional traits. This is where we might be scoring that maternal behaviour score. We can also score lambing ease, so did you have to assist the ewe at all? And we can also record birth weight on the lamb. So for those that are not at the birth site, what we're doing is, say at marking, we're identifying the dams of live lambs, which is us getting dam pedigree. You know, that could be through DNA, it could be through using proximity technology like collars to get that information. What we're doing is we've preg scanned for multiples, so we're actually using that information as the birth type of the lamb. And then we're identifying the ewes that have lamb and lost by comparing the scan result to the live lambs that the dam has been matched to. So I'm going to dive into that for a moment on the next slide. We also get date of birth, and this can be a fair range in the amount of accuracy we're getting as a date of birth. We might be using early, mids, and late preg scanning to get a more accurate birth date. We could be drifting ewes and lambs as they're born through to capture that information. And we're getting the conception method of the lamb. So I'm just going to take a moment to dive into what the process actually is if we're using preg scans as birth type and matching dams to lambs later. So what we're actually doing here is we're using our DAB tags, our dead at birth tags, to fill in the gap between the preg scan and the parentage. So it's really important that these aren't real dead at birth lambs because we're not tagging at birth. So we actually don't know how we lost these lambs, but the ewe was scanned, say, with multiples and matched to a single. So what happens is the pregnancy scan becomes the birth type of the ewe and of the lambs. The rare type is the result after matching those live lambs to dams. So I've got an example here where I've got a ewe that was scanned with twins, but she was only matched to one lamb, let's say through DNA parentage. So that live lamb has a birth type of 2, which is based off the pregnancy scan of the dam, and a rare type of 1, because we only matched that ewe to one lamb. What we're then doing is we're filling in the gap with a dead at birth tag, where this lamb also has a birth type of 2 based off the preg scan of mum. However, its rare type is 0. And this purple lamb here, it's essentially a fictitious lamb. We don't have any information on it. We just know that the ewe was scanned a twin. However, we've only matched her to a single. As you can imagine, there's quite a few considerations if we're using this process. So the first is that you must be getting parentage or pedigree, dam pedigree on the entire cohort. Because, for example, if we've just selectively pedigreed, we could be penalising a ewe for losing her lambs when in reality her lambs just didn't get parentage tested or put a collar on them, or however we're getting pedigree. The second consideration is that we have to have quite a lot of confidence in our pregnancy scanner. So this process, it's up to the breeder whether or not they use it. So we actually need you to fill in those dead at birth tags and the birth type, because we want to know that you have confidence in your preg scanner rather than us just making assumptions at the analysis end. Because as you can see from this method, the accuracy of birth type is very dependent on the accuracy of your preg scanner. One other consideration is that you may be capturing other types of lamb loss. So, for example, in utero loss, reabsorption, which again, it's up to you how confident you feel about using that information. I know I've spoken to some breeders who, as far as they're concerned, reabsorption is still that you losing a lamb. So it's really a personal decision around whether or not you're going to use this method. And then we all come back together again, those that were tagging at birth versus those that are getting information later. We come back together again at weaning, and this is where we're recording the survival of the lambs that are born, and we're adjusting rare types as needed. So, for example, a lamb was present at marking, however doesn't turn up at weaning, we adjust his rare type to say that he died. What's really important is that we also adjust the rare type of the siblings, and this information is used for the ewe variability trait. We'd also really like an early measurement on all reared lambs, for example, a weaning weight. And what that'll do is, firstly, it allows us to capture the full variation of the cohort, hopefully before there's too much culling or classing happening. What it also does is it will allow us to have a look at your rare type consistencies. You know how we're looking at birth type consistency in this evaluation. We'd also love to be able to compare the rare types of the lambs to the number of lambs that are actually present at weaning. Okay, so for our maternal and merino breeders, at the moment you're receiving some reports that'll help you identify how well you're recording each of these traits, and then also fill in any gaps, help you to fill in any gaps where we're not getting information for whatever reason. So at the moment, you're getting a PDF report called Reproduction Breeding Values. And what the first page or the first couple of pages of this report are, is there a summary of the number of records we have for each of these component traits. So the number in this report is a count of the ewes. So for conception, so on the left-hand side here, we've got our year of joining. So in this case, we're looking at a 2020 joining. And then what we've done is we've broken down the information by the ewes' year of birth. So for the 2020 joining, we have 136 ewes from the 2018 drop that have a conception record that's used in this evaluation. So all of these traits here with a Y, that's just referring to that yearling trait. So that's our ewe lambs. So our Y con and con traits, columns, these should reflect the number of ewes that you've joined. Our litter size, so YLS and LS, this should reflect the number of pregnant ewes. So it won't include your dry ewes because they shouldn't, or they won't have a litter size record because they're dry. Our ewe rearing ability, so we've got their YERA and ERA. This should reflect the ewes that have lambed, so the ones that have a ewe rearing ability record. We then have our condition score information, so YCS and CS, and that is if you're condition scoring, that should reflect the ewes that are present at joining, because we're condition scoring in that 30 days in the lead up to joining. And then we've got maternal behaviour score on the right-hand side, so MBS. And that's again, if you're tagging at birth, that should reflect the number of ewes that have lambed. These Y columns, they will be populated if you're joining ewe lambs. That'll give you a count of those ewe lambs. So there's a couple of common gaps that we see when going through these reports. The first is that conception should reflect the number of ewes that are joined. However, commonly, if conception is too high in a joining group or we're missing dry ewes, we'll drop that group out of the conception part of the evaluation. We also have what we call a service-sire failure filter. So that's where the conception of a group of lambs that have been, a group of ewes that have been joined to a sire is too low. We actually drop them out for a conception because we believe it was an issue with the ram, and we don't want to penalise the ewes for his poor performance. For litter size, it should reflect the number of ewes pregnant, so this will not include our dry ewes. And then for ewe rearing ability, this should reflect the number of ewes that are lambing. So it's important when you're looking at these counts to consider your flock mortality. So how many ewes are you losing through that reproduction cycle? And then we also have common exclusions for if the rearing percentage is too low or too high. So that would be where we're missing our dead at birth lambs or lambs that have a rare type of 0. So I've pulled out a real example here. On the left-hand side, we've got the year of joining, and then we've got the count of ewes recorded for conception, litter size, and ewe rearing ability in each of these joining events. So for 2008 to 2010, this flock hadn't been submitting any dry ewe information, which is why no ewes were getting conception records, because we just didn't have any variation in our conception trait because everything that we were getting information on was pregnant. In 2011, what you see is we've got 230 ewes recorded for conception. However, that number goes up to 312 for litter size and ewe rearing ability. And normally we would expect that to be the other way because conception should be a count of the ewes that were joined. Litter size should be a count of the ewes that are pregnant and lambed. So in this case, this breeder had one group of ewes that their conception was too high in. So they got dropped out of the conception part of the evaluation, however, was still included in the litter size and ewe variability part. So it was just their conception that was impacted because that was the trait we didn't have any variation in for that single joining group. And then finally in 2013, I'm just highlighting this because it's sort of from the outside looking in, that's what we expect to see at Sheep Genetics when we're going through reports, where we've got a higher number of ewes with a conception record, and then this drops away slightly between litter size and ewe variability, and often the difference between these two will just be the dry ewes because they don't have a litter size or a variability record because they're not pregnant. So as you're going through this PDF report, please get in touch if you can't get to the bottom of any gaps that you're seeing on that report. That's what we're here for. We're here to help. So just to sum up, if reproduction is in your breeding objective, it's really important to record it as directly as possible. Sheep Genetics provide reports to help you identify those gaps in your recording of those component reproduction traits. And we're here to help. So please get in touch if you have any questions or just want to chat more about reproduction. We're pretty excited about everything that's happening in this space and more than happy to talk you through it. Thank you.